Exploring the Mind. That's the Power of Love. Compassion, Love, and Transformation in Urban America, in partnership with the U of M Department of Psychology.
Good evening. Oh, no. I study religion. I study religion in the Black context. So let's start this again. Good evening. Amen. I love this. Better response. So I am really excited to share this work with you tonight. And particularly excited in part because one of the things that sort of motivates me to do the work that I do is having grown up in urban context. So I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, grew up in the Bronx, New York, and have moved around from one city to another. And as I moved into graduate school, one of the things that I realized is that the things that made my family, and the things that made me interested in being a psychologist in general, we weren't really studying in the way that felt human to me. So my life's goal has been to try to figure out how to humanize a discipline that I really love. So bear with me over the next hour, and I'm going to hope to leave plenty of time for us to really talk. So let's spend some time talking about love. So if we want to talk about love, we can't talk about that for me without talking about the people who make the work I do possible. So on the screen here are 5 amazing, incredible doctoral students who, number 1, give me life. Number 2, make the work that I do meaningful. And number 3, make the work possible in every possible way. So Gordon Palmer, Janelle Goodwill, Costa Guillaume, Christina Morton, and Kayla Fike. And some of them are in the audience tonight, so from me to you, thank you. And we also have in the audience a number of our undergraduate students who are doing the hard work of, again, making this work come to life. So thank you to all of you as well, and thank you to all of you who came out tonight. So as Thad mentioned, I'm really interested in urban context. I'm really interested in why we study urban context the way that we do, and really sort of rethinking that. So part of the work that I do focuses on religion and spirituality, what people believe in, and how their belief in a higher power ultimately helps shape who they become. I'm interested in parents and how parents love, and particularly low-income parents who we have a particular narrative around that suggests that low-income parents don't necessarily love as well as middle-income parents, which is really interesting and also wrong. So I'm interested in how parents talk about the ways that they love the children that they have brought into the world, and how they love each other as they do that work of parenting. But I'm also, as Thad mentioned, interested in character strengths. I'm interested in positive psychology, but positive psychology for me has been a bit problematic, in part because it's so acontextual, right? So when we study positive psychology, we often study happiness in college students, which is fine. But college students come from somewhere, and they live somewhere, and they come from people. And sometimes the places that they come from aren't particularly happy places, but still they thrive, right? I'm interested in people who aren't in college. So the work I do tends to be in community contexts. And I'm interested in fundamentally how and why people choose to love when the conditions that they're living in suggest that they would not. So everything that I talk about tonight will be centered around that. So I study altruism and forgiveness and empathy and compassion, and why, again, people care for each other. But I do that in specific contexts. I study urban context, and we're going to talk a little bit about urban before we start talking about love, because urban is a problematic term. It isn't supposed to be, but it is. So we want to talk about urban in part because urban has a meaning. And so any context, according to the US Census Bureau, any context that includes 2,500 or to 50,000 people, those contexts are defined as urban clusters. But urban areas are any area, any defined human settlement that has a population of 50,000 or more. And we can talk about densely populated urban centers when we start talking about how many people live in a square mile, right? But if you live in a place that has 50,000 or more, you live in an urban context, which is a lot of the context that we live in. Now, urbanization is important for us to study because it is, according to the UN, one of the principal issues that is going to face the human community over the next 100 years. Why? Because if you look at these data, in 1950, 751 people across the world lived in urban settlements. By 2030, 43 megacities will exist with 10 million people or more. And by 2050, 6.7 billion people on this planet will be living in urban areas, right? So urbanization is happening at a massive rate. And in fact, one of the things that the UN talks about is that in the next 20 to 50 years, the next 30 to 50 years, 82% of North Americans currently live in urban areas, but by 2050, 87% of Americans will, and 87% of the world's population will. Now, urban areas occupy 3% of the land mass on the planet. So 87% of the world's population will be living on 3% of the land mass on Earth, right? If you want to find a formula for something special to happen, put 87% of the people in the world on 3% of the land mass, and you're going to have some interesting social dynamics, which is important in part because if we don't figure out how to understand urban areas in a way that maximizes strengths, we're going to be in trouble. Right? And right now, we don't maximize our thinking about strengths when we're talking about urban areas. In fact, Jude Clark, who is a sociologist and a cultural studies theorist, says so much of the conceptualization and representation of urban areas and ourselves within these spaces is an enactment of complex and multi-layered interweaving of culture, tradition, race, gender, and class. Any discourse about identity and the politics of location is always contingent upon an analysis of history and power and holds possibilities for the emergence of new and innovative sites of meaning. So let's get simple. When we talk about urban, what we're really talking about most of the time is a very particular kind of stereotype about what these areas look like. So urban, when we talk about them, mixes these ideas about class and race and social chaos, right? So if if I say the word urban in most places and I talk about inner cities, people have a particular vision of what those places look like, who occupies them, and what's going on in those places, and it usually isn't good. And our public representations of urban areas usually include representations of crime and, again, all sorts of negative life outcomes. So we equate urban with low-income Black urban communities that are represented in public and private spaces as morally and socially chaotic. People get pregnant early, people drop out of school, et cetera, et cetera. We focus on distress and the disruption of human relationships, particularly family relationships, absentee fathers, etc., even when those narratives are untrue. And we spend a lot of time, if you Google urban and if you do a search in psychology on urban communities or urban psychology, you almost always come up with some variation of risk or aggression, etc. So individuals in urban settings are seen as catalysts of social and moral chaos and are seen as responsible for the chaos that they live in. Here's among the many problems with this kind of representation, the least of which is the fact that these representations are really flattening. They're also disproportionately untrue, right? So most urban communities are not especially violent. Most middle-class suburban communities are not especially safe. Crime happens everywhere, right? So we have a particular tendency to think about spaces, urban spaces, as problematic when they aren't. But one of the things that we fail to contemplate is how love shows up in these spaces. So we're going to do that together tonight. So one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison, I think is a wonderful guide for helping us to think about the language that we use when we talk about urban spaces. And she says, oppressive language, like the language of moral and social chaos and risk, etc. Oppressive language does more than represent violence, it is violence. It does more than represent the limits of knowledge, it limits knowledge. This is really important for us because our ability to understand communities, our ability to understand people who live in urban spaces is really limited by the language of risk and chaos that we tend to use. So we're going to shift that a little bit. So as we go into this talk, we want to think about the kind of labor that the language and the representations that we see around urban centers do. And I'm going to use the language of epistemic labor just because, you know, I'm a scholar and I have to try to pretend that, you know, this is what we do, right? So I'm going to be spooky for a minute with the language I use just after I talked about spooky language and problematic language. So the representations that we do epistemic labor. If you continually see and hear about spaces as spaces of risk, if people are continually represented as people at risk, we come to think of them that way. We come to think of us in those particular ways. If the only representations that we see of urban communities are representations of crime and, again, social and moral chaos, we begin to believe in the truth value of that. So those representations do labor in that they reinforce the idea that these things are real and really real. They do emotional labor because when people hear urban, they often have an immediate response of fear. And those fears, psychology has demonstrated, have real implications for the way that people engage urban communities. So one of the things that we know about urban communities from the work of one of our former colleagues, Steve Rodenbush, is that people assume that the presence of people of color equals the presence of crime, even when the statistics, the data don't support it, right? So there's, and people's fear of crime ultimately leads to all sorts of outcomes. They move out of communities, they tend to vote in particular ways. So the emotional labor, the creation of fear, et cetera, is important in urban contexts. And it does political labor. When you're afraid of things, you're going to vote and act in ways that will cause structures of power to use power to control particular bodies and particular kinds of communities. So the representations that we see are problematic in part because they create epistemic injustice. And this is going to lead us into the work that we are doing now. So Eleni Herbert talks about epistemic injustice as, she says, I define epistemic injustice as any time marginalized bodies are denied credibility based solely on their status as other. Conversely, epistemic privilege occurs whenever those in power are given credibility based solely on their elevated or authoritative status within society. Epistemic injustice is not just a problem of knowing, it reaches far beyond the scope of traditional epistemology and roots itself in both the social and political. It is, at a fundamental level, a tool used to control and oppress already marginalized populations. So my work in studying love is not about sentimentality. It's not just about rewriting the story of African Americans or of urban communities. It's about undoing epistemic injustice. It's about giving people who live in a community an opportunity to frame for us who they are and not have people who are in the academy frame for them who they are. So how do we do this? Through love. We shall gather together and sing. Love. So if we're going to undo epistemic injustice, we've got to think about love. We've got to ask different questions than we usually do about urban settings. We've got to tell a different story. We've got to shift who tells the story, and we've got to shift the lens from a focus on social and moral disorder to a focus on love. So let's define love as we begin to study love. So what is love? It's funny, we use the word love all the time. We love our shoes, we love our children, we love where we live, but we rarely define what love is. So here's the working definition that we have for the next few minutes. So love is a cognitive, behavioral, and emotional stance towards others that is marked by affection, care, protectiveness, commitment, passion, desire, safety, happiness, and the experience of holding others dear. So when we talk about love, one or more of those elements of thinking about or feeling about people and behaving towards people is present. So here are the questions that my amazing, incredible graduate students and I asked. We asked two questions as we went into a community. We've launched a study called Urban Love, where it's a mixed method study. We're doing some surveys and some interviews with people. And we asked, what are the manifestations of love for people living with the complexities of urban life? Like, how does love show up in urban spaces? And then, because we're interested in how things work, not just how people feel, we want to know, how does love operate? What does it do for people? So in trying to sort of unpack the answers to those questions, I'm going to introduce you to three people: Derrick, Sanika, and Erica. So bear with me, because I think it's really important, because the voices of people in urban settings are so rarely heard, it's really important for me to lift their words up. So I'm going to share with you some fairly long clips from interviews that we did with these three individuals. And we have 43 individuals in total. I will not do that to you, because we have to leave at some point tonight. So let me introduce you to Derrick. So Derrick is a 67-year-old man. These are not their pictures. Thank God for internet and pictures. Derrick is a 67-year-old African-American man who spent much of his adult life struggling with addiction to one or more substances. He spent some time incarcerated, and at some point, about 10 years ago, got clean, and then began his work of trying to figure out how to give back to a community that he thought loved him through the worst moments of his life. And at this point, he is a drug counselor living in a large city where we interviewed him. So one of the things that comes through in the vignette that you're going to hear is the theme that love makes our best selves visible. So Derrick says, when I was looking for a sponsor, I was being asked to give up all this stuff that I thought I knew, everything at once. I was asked to give it up, and I needed a guide. And your sponsor becomes that guide. And when I asked this guy, Khalil, to be my sponsor, and he said, I think that was the first time somebody loved me without asking anything from me. And I knew, wow, He said, because you remember, I was so disfigured and so mangled inside, and I don't believe anybody. There was no belief. There was no acceptance. Just, that's not true. You don't really think that way about me. Even if somebody gives you the highest accolade, oh, you don't believe. But when I asked him, oh, so simple, yes, Derrick, I'll sponsor you. And then he gave me some basic instructions. Meet me here on Saturday. And when I met him there, he actually given me some good, and then he starts crying. He actually given me his friendship. This is just another man sitting back there, taking time to be with you because he believes that you're better than what you think you are or know yourself to be. That was it. Unconditional. Nothing. Just wanting to see me better. This notion that when we are least able to hold a vision of our best self, love, even from someone who is a stranger, is the thing that can hold for us that vision until we can hold it ourselves. That comes through over and over again in these men's narratives. So I asked Derrick, how did being loved that way by your sponsor, by the people who loved you, how has that changed who you are and how you love and do the work that you do here? How has it changed you? And his response highlights the fact that love ends up being catalytic and transcendent, because he says, I think it helps me to be aware, because love is active. Love is activist. It's operating. It supersedes the mind. It goes past whatever your concepts are, and it does the work. It delivers the package. Again, that notion of love being catalytic, we usually think about love as a feeling, right? But for a lot of folks that we talk to, love is a verb. It's something that does things, that achieves outcomes. Derrick goes on to describe other aspects of how love operates for him. And the ways that he describes them highlights the fact that love inspires critical thinking. Some of my students study sociopolitical development. And for him, that's what love does. It makes you a political being. It helps you think about humanity and honor humanity in a different way. He said, I started to grow because I started to ask questions. It's the questions that bring the clarity on. What is this condition? Oh, it's disenfranchisement. And now I strive to see that this condition is not brought on by the people themselves, but it's the condition of the system itself. So love led him to an understanding that his own experience, while certainly he owns personal responsibility, he recognizes that the conditions of the people he's living around in a community that is really struggling, those conditions are a result of racism and sexism and classism and the disinvestment from community, and it's only through love that he comes to that kind of critical knowledge. But he says, and so loving people means that I have to say, I want to see good for you. And he talks about this in the same way that Khalil did this for him. That's how love starts to operate in my life. You know, one of the things I learned about love, it says, leave a man with his dignity. So in the work that he does, he talks about the fact that because he has been loved so well by Khalil and other people who have come into his life at various points, the work that he does as a counselor is rooted in a sense that no matter how far people fall, he is going to be committed to making sure that they know that they are always seen as worthwhile. He's going to leave them with their dignity. So that's Derrick. So Sanika. Sanika was, or is a young woman I met doing these interviews who, the backdrop of her story is really important, as it is the backdrop of each of these people's stories. When Sanika was 15 years old, her mom, who was again struggling with both mental health issues and addiction, left Sanika with her four younger siblings, when she, again, was 15 years old. She walked away, left them in a hotel, paid 1 month of the hotel bill, and she disappeared for 3 years. And eventually Sanika was able to find her. But Sanika at 15 didn't have a job, so she couldn't pay the hotel bill. So Sanika and her siblings ended up living in what she calls Tent City. It was a space for homeless men and women, where people lived literally in tents. And from the age of 15 until she graduated from high school, the men and women living in those tents became her parents. And she talks about the fact that these men and women, all of whom had been thrown away by society, when they went out and begged for food or money, they would come back and feed her and her siblings before they fed themselves. Ultimately, she was an excellent student. She was an A student, graduated with the top grades in her high school class. But because she had to walk so far from where she was living on the streets, and she wouldn't go to a shelter because they would have taken her siblings from her and put them in foster care. And her way of loving was she was never going to let her siblings be in foster care. But she said that she graduated with the top grades in her class. The men and women on the street knew that she was an excellent student, so they knew she was being bullied because of the smell of her clothes, and so were her peers. So they would take the clothes off of the kids, wash the clothes, put their clothes on the kids, bring them new, clean clothes, and then send them off to school, and they would, again, feed them to the best ability. But because Sanika had to walk so far to school, she was late every day. So even though she graduated with an A+ average, she was not allowed to be valedictorian. But the men and women knew she was that were her parents, this community of parents, knew she wanted to go to college, and so they paid for all the money that they gathered. They took a portion of the money that they got every day, and they put together a pool of funds that they used to help her pay for her college applications. And none of them knew how planes worked. They knew that you had to pay for a plane ticket, but they didn't know how that went. So everyone assumed it was sort of like a bus ticket. You show up with your money. Sanika got into all 8 colleges that she applied to. And she wanted to go to a particular historically Black school. And her parents raised the money to buy a plane ticket as much as they could. So she went to the airport to try to get the plane ticket, and unfortunately the person at the counter, she was trying to buy a ticket on the spot, and the person told her, in her words, "I don't know why you black people think that you are entitled to special treatment. You can't get on a plane today." And she said that was the end of her college career. Yeah. But she talks about how she has used that experience as a way to turn back around to take care of her parents now that she is 24 years old. She is employed, and she has a home of her own, an apartment she rents, and as many of her parents as she can fit into her apartment without getting kicked out, she has living with her. So she has 4 of her parents living with her in a 1-bedroom apartment, and they remind her all the time that for them, she's their college kid. But she talks about the experience. She said, for my whole junior year when I was 16, I was going to school. I stayed inside a tent outside the shelter. It was hard because the teachers would always get on me for being late. I'd lost a lot of weight, but every day there was always someone to help me up in Tent City. I would walk down the street and these African-American men, they'd be like, "Child coming, hide your drugs. Young lady, stay in school, don't do drugs." These are the nicest people to me. People who live in the streets, people who look like me. So the sacrifices come through, and that prophetic ability to see her as a college student even before she could, and to imagine her in that role even when her teachers couldn't, that comes through very profoundly. And she said Miss Jenny, who was one of the moms she stayed with in her tent more so than anyone else, Miss Jenny, she would say to me, "You don't want to be here. I don't want to see you here forever." And she let me lay in her tent with her. They pushed me. They helped me up when no one believed in me. The fact that they were willing to give even the little bit that they had to lift me up was more than enough to keep me going a whole day. So she goes on to talk about the ways in which, in the moment when she thought of herself as the same as her conditions, being loved by the multiple parents who were helping to raise her and her siblings, helped to reshape things. So the theme that comes through is that love dismantles constraints, and love lies in the small things. It's in the words we say to each other, and in the fact that we look at each other in small moments. She says, I remember a lady who was, it's amazing to me because me and her both in the shelter. And I remember she told me, she was like, these names, these definitions they put on you, they don't define you. To me, kindness is being pushed. And she talks about the fact that love is being pushed. It's what I've been given by every last person that's literally as unfortunate as me who's pushing me up. Even just the words that you give. Your words to me is more than enough. Being there to uplift another person is more than enough. The small things. She talks about love being something that creates opportunities for grace and redemption. And remember, we talked about, I mentioned the fact that her mom left her and her siblings. And their relationship was tumultuous. And her mom asked things of her that no mother should ever ask of a daughter. Despite that, she says, my mom, no matter, even though she kicked me out, when I hit 21, I got my apartment. I paid for her to come on the bus to see me for 2 days. And those were the hardest 2 days because she kept on saying sorry. She kept saying, sorry, I love you. She was like, I just didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to do. Being a single mother raising 5 kids, having the only man she's ever been with pass away, I learned what it means to have trauma. You've been through enough trauma, she says to her mom. I told her, you never have to say sorry to me. I said, my heart, my destiny, my life started the day you left. It's still going, and I'm never going to give up, never going to stop. I tell everybody, every person that I see in Tent City, I'm like, you guys right here, you guys make the most difference. The capacity for unbelievable forgiveness, that capacity to love, despite the fact that, she has plenty of reasons to be angry, to be rejecting of her mom. But for her, the ability to see in her mom what trauma does when it lands on someone you love. and to be able to do the perspective taking of, I know you would never have left us if you had other alternatives. That capacity is love in her, but it's what love does for her mom to give her the opportunity to experience grace, unearned favor, and to experience redemption. The final part of Sanika's story that I want to share is the way that she talks about love as something that rereads our conditions and gives people opportunities to read a different script about their life and life possibilities in a way that allows them to survive. So she says, I used to tell my little brothers and sisters, I say, every single time you guys feel like you're by yourself, you feel that weight on your shoulders, that someone's leaning over you, that's someone leaning over you, looking at you in your face, telling you to keep going. I'm like, it's not stress, it's that spirit, right? So to reread pressure as somebody loving, looking over your shoulder, which is usually her, and had been for most of her siblings' life. That capacity to reread difficult moments as moments not where you don't give up, but as moments where you recognize that you're being loved through it. It may feel like pressure, but it's something different. The third and final story is Erica. And Erica is a young woman who is 27 years old. Like Sanika and like Derrick, Erica spent much of her life living in and out of shelters. And at this point, she's working actually for a shelter, helping to take care of families who live through what she lived through. And the first part of her story, the theme that comes through is that love sees the divine and the sacred in everyone. So Erica is talking about one of the things that she does over and over again when people come through the doors of the shelter, regardless of how they smell, what they look like, what's happened to their bodies. She has a way of lovingly and gently taking care of them. And so a number of people in the shelter pointed her to me, and she said eventually about this particular woman, she talked to me. She said, my back itch. And she's older, and I have a mom, and I'm just like, your back itch? And then like recently she came back because she lives, in the shelter, and they're sleeping outside and stuff, And then she came, she had medicine and stuff, and she was like, can you help me? And I'm like, my first thought was, I didn't even think I had a first thought because I knew I was never going to turn her away, because I have lupus myself. Probably that's why I wasn't scared, was because they're God's people. And this is what we're here to do, Again, that capacity to see in people who have been thrown away by communities, who wouldn't be touched by others, to be able to see them as God, as God's people, and to recognize that our only purpose on the planet is to make sure that we take care of each other and take care of God's people. And in the context of the same story, she talks about love creating a space for vulnerability, and particularly for this woman to be vulnerable enough to ask for help. Her coworker says to her, she says, my coworker was like, how you think that made her feel? Because she really didn't have nobody to do that. For her to put it on her back the right way. He told me, she may not have trusted nobody to do that for her, She wouldn't just come and just ask you, to do that for her. I remember I put my gloves on. I went in the bathroom, and when I seen her back, I was just like, Jesus. Like, her back was just all ate up. They claimed it was fleas. She was like, thank you, thank you. And I'm just like, no, thank you. Because, I feel good doing that for her, because I'm just like, you in pain. Like, it shouldn't even be. You shouldn't even have to be living like this. It's, it's too much. Again, that capacity, which we hear over and over again, of love being something that humbles us so that we recognize that, number one, it's not about us, that our job is to care for others. But Erica, love inspires in her a sense of gratitude. The fact that this woman trusted her enough to allow her to care for her is something that she feels deeply grateful for, and she needs to communicate that. And it's that same love, just like Derrick talked about, that inspires critical awareness. The recognition that people shouldn't have to live this way, which is why we have to love. And the final thing that she talks about, which others in our interviews talk about, is the fact that love has cascading effects. It doesn't just affect the one or two people in the moment. That when people watch you loving, they end up loving sometimes even more powerfully, and they love more broadly, and they love others who they wouldn't have loved in a variety of ways. So she talks about, she says, but I learned it from Paul and Miss D. Now, Paul is the person who runs the shelter. And person after person in this community talks about the fact that he is a man who they can't think of someone more loving than him. He shows up early, he stays late. He talks with people as if they were the best of relatives, even when he doesn't know them. When people are walking by, if they're drunk, he has them come in like, come on, why don't you sit down? You look like the world's leaning today, right? He finds a way of making, even conditions that we would humiliate people about, he finds a way of making it a human moment. And so people in the community love Paul, and Miss D is his partner in crime. They run the shelter together. But she says, I learned it from Paul and Miss D. They help so many people, you know? So it's like, why not be helping? The normalization of love, the normalization of help is something that comes through. It helps somebody out. Love has cascading effects. So what's the take-home message? Fundamentally, the take-home message is it matters that we choose not to study love. The fact that we sentimentalize love so that we think of it as something that that isn't science, that we can't do a science around, is deeply problematic, because what we do know is that for every human being, the capacity to love and be loved is central. None of us can survive without it. It's the thing that is central to our humanity. So if we as social scientists choose not to study love, it's a choice. And it's the easiest way to dehumanize people, to absent them from the story of love and the capacity to be loved. So when we pay attention to the stories that show up, when we recognize that if we make love visible and we study how it's operating and how it's showing up, we can learn some things about the human condition. And here are some things that are takeaways. And again, this repeats some of the points that we talked about. Love and the sacrifices that we make in love make people visible. Love is about legibility. It writes people into existence. Love ignites the prophetic imagination. When people love you, they can see a you that does not yet exist, and somehow they can help you walk across the bridge from the you that is right now to the best version of you that has yet to come. Toni Morrison, in her novel Beloved, she has a character, Paul D., who talks about a woman that he walks miles to see, and they call her the 3-mile woman because he walks 3 miles to go see her. And he says, they ask him why he does that, and he says, all the pieces of me that are broken, she puts them in the palm of her hand and she hands them back to me whole. And that for me is love. And so that capacity for people to be able to put the pieces of you back together and to show you the version of you that does not exist is part of what love does. It's part of the prophetic imagination. Love pushes people up and it pushes people forward. As Derrick and others talk about, love is the thing that fuels resilience. When we are out of everything that we know, it's the knowledge that someone loves us or that we love someone else that pushes us to be able to bounce up. Love requires us to preserve the dignity of others, right? And again, Derrick talks about this, the recognition that if you love someone, whether it's through your personal life or through the work that you do, if you love someone, if you love the work that you're doing, you do the work in a way that honors other people's dignity and humanity. To steal Derrick's word, love is activist. It engenders sociopolitical awareness. It makes us recognize if you love people, when you see them living with injustice, you recognize what injustice is, and you find a way to name it, whatever however complex it might be. So love is a thing that engenders critical awareness. Love creates opportunities for grace and redemption. None of us deserve the good things that we have in life and the ways that we're treated. We all will do things for which we need forgiveness. But when we are loved by others, they give us the grace to be able to bounce up to, again, the better version of ourselves and give us an opportunity to redeem even the worst parts of what we have done and who we have been. Love allows us to see the sacred and the divine in ourselves and in others, but it also allows us to do that in our work. So whatever it is we do, we have opportunities if we're working with people to be able to love others through that work. And to the extent that we can see the sacred in others, we have an opportunity to be able to live divinely through the work that we do. Love rereads our conditions. So as Seneca says to her siblings, when you feel that pressure, it's not stress, it's somebody looking over your shoulder. It's the people who are loving you and guiding you in that moment. So love rereads us into a different way of understanding the script of what we are living out and allows us to be able to see our conditions as conditions of possibility as opposed to conditions of hopelessness. And finally, love has cascading effects. Love doesn't enter into a vacuum. When people watch us loving, it activates things in us and in them that allows them to be able to be different than they would be otherwise. So, final thoughts. Going back to epistemic justice. Knowing people's condition is not the same as knowing people. Knowing that people live in poverty tells you nothing about the people, it tells you about the condition. So for us, and for me, thinking about love in terms of epistemic justice, my goal is to think about how do we, even in the context of understanding the condition, and particularly because of the condition that people are living in, how do we come to see their humanity fully in the context of that? So using conditions as a landscape, not as a replacement for human beings. It's important for me to keep in mind, and I think for all of us to keep in mind, that a just humanistic psychology requires us to be deeply connected to people. It can't be about variables, it can't be about analyses, it has to be about the people and the stories that they're living. But science has to be courageous. It has to be radically courageous. So if we're going to do this thing, we have to be able to build a science of love that is truly a science. And we have to recognize that this is not about sentimentality. It's about recognizing that if we're going to dismantle injustice, if we're going to be able to understand the human condition and help people move through it, we've got to first see people as people in the fullness and the lovingness of themselves. So I'll end with this. A friend and colleague of mine, Niobe Way, who's at NYU, we were talking one day, she told me this parable that has stayed with me. And that is a parable for me about the way that we do our work and why we should do the work that we do, the way we do it. She said, there's an old man who is looking for a particular place, and he passes another older man on the road, and he says, I'm trying to get to this particular place. How would I get there from here? And the man he asks gives him all sorts of instructions. He said, okay, let me just stop, and I'll tell you the simple way. If you want to get there, I wouldn't start from here. And that for me is really important. If we want to get to a science or a psychology where we understand love, we've got to dismantle the way that we do our work. We can't start from the here that we know. We've got to figure out how to set a different foundation. Think differently about human beings, think differently about the work that we do, the methodologies we use, and our responsibility to the people whose stories we're going to tell. We've got to start there if we want to get to the here we want to get to. So with that, I'll stop.
More. I'm sure you already had some thinking about how you want to see the science going. Mm-hmm. So can you elaborate a bit more about this point?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is important to me is thinking about, number one, we need a vocabulary to describe the multiple variations of love other than romantic love. I mean, there are things that we typically talk about. But there are ways that people talk about what it means to hold someone so deeply in your heart, your spirit, that you care for them, even when you don't know them. right? And so I don't know that we have as rich a vocabulary as we need in order to be able to describe the various ways that people talk about and describe love as they experience it. So I think that's one of the things that we need, is a bigger vocabulary. But I think we also need to figure out how to be quiet and how to see beyond the things that we usually see. So there's a body of work that talks about the mundanity of goodness, right? And the ways in which we choose not to study goodness because it seems so mundane, it seems so everyday, that we discard it. But evil, right, which is really rare, right? We will rarely come upon someone who's truly evil, right? Or truly mean, or truly violent. But those things capture our imagination in ways that make them seem bigger than they actually are, right? Which is not to downplay the impact of violence, or the impact of evil. But if something is the ordinary, we should figure out a way to study it, right? So one of the things that I think is important in a science of love is to figure out how to see the things that disappear from us because they're so everyday. To see how people care for each other in community. So again, I grew up in large urban settings, and people talk about altruism as being relatively rare in urban settings. And like, for those of us who come from cities, I can see some nods from people who I know grew up in cities. People do uncommonly kind things all the time, right? Everything from giving money to someone who needs money, right? Giving food to someone who's on the street. Walking by and saying, "Hey, sir," to someone who's never called sir, right? Or "Hey, ma'am," or just the everyday looking at and attending to. Those moments of kindness are what allow us to be able to thrive as human beings, but we miss them. So the long answer to your question is, I think one of the things that we have to do is to think about, if we turn our attention to the mundane, how do we see the things that disappear from us so readily? And how do we begin to measure those things in a way that, because they disappear, it becomes hard to think about, like, how do you pay attention to the eye contact, right? Or the decision to touch, right? How do we begin to do that kind of science in a way that allows us to lift it up as not meaningless and not anomalous?
I just want to say thank you for doing such important work that a lot of people probably just curious about love and think, oh, that mushy, they have no idea, and it's so important to human beings, and we really need to get on this.
Absolutely.
Going, but anyway,
thank you.
Quite brave.
Thank you.
It is.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I give credit to my students.
Well, I thought I heard in the beginning when he was introducing you. I have to. I'll repeat your question so everyone can hear it.
Okay, yes.
Oh, he's recording. Oh. I thought I heard in your introduction something about empathy that had really, I latched onto that, and I didn't think it really was covered. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if it was something that you studied and know how to cultivate, or if someone has it or doesn't have it, it won't change.
Yeah, well, so it's one of the things that is required for love is empathy. So when the work that we do, so our team is called Elated Lab, right? Exploring love and transformative engagement in the diaspora, right? One of the things that we study is empathy. And empathy has two different components, right? There's a cognitive and an emotional component of empathy. So the emotional part is what we usually talk about as emotional empathy or just empathy. But there's a cognitive part that is perspective taking. It's your ability to sort of get inside the experience of the other and not just imagine how you would feel if you were in that circumstance. That's not perspective taking. Perspective taking is being able to put yourself genuinely in the space of the other and understand from their perspective how things are unfolding. It's the thing that allows us to be able to love deeply, right? That capacity both to feel what people are feeling, but also to imagine the world from their perspective. Because you imagine the level of bravery it takes, especially when you don't like someone, right? So when you love someone, right, it's easier to put yourself in their perspective. But when you don't like someone, to be able to say, I may not like you, I don't dig you, but I can understand when I see what you are doing and how you're living and the space that you're occupying, I can understand why you experience or think the way that you do, right? So those things are embedded in love. Compassion is embedded in love. The capacity and the willingness to forgive is embedded in love, which doesn't make it easy, but the grace that is required when people harm you in any way, to be able to say, this is important enough, or your humanity is important enough for me to be able to figure out how to forgive you for what you have done. But it's because it's reciprocal. When other people love us, they do the same grace to us, right? And for us. So love requires all of those sort of big things, including things that we don't talk about or study, like awe, right? If you ever watch, like, babies' eyelashes, like what, right? Come on now. You give them your PIN number because they've got the long eyelashes and they're just cute, and there's something that evokes in you this sense of, I can't let anything harm this person because they're sacred. So the sacred is embedded in love, right? So to study love is to study all of those things as they're sort of living through the emotion that we tend to sort of ball up under those 4 letters.
So Jackie, this was a phenomenal talk because you're a phenomenal human being.
Thank you. Cash is coming to you in 20 minutes.
Sure. So as somebody who is also from the Bronx, I heavily came to Michigan as a researcher, as a scholar, to give back to my community. And I know you are the same way because you definitely published a paper on altruism. And that inspired me to do what I want to do in the future. So I'm wondering if you can give some specific tips on the ways that you have given back to your community so that we can continue to do what works.
It's an interesting thing. So there are different, for me, there are different ways of giving back, right? So one of them is trying to make sure that I teach and engage with students in a way that allows them to be fully brilliant and fully genius without the consequences of having people tell you that you can't do certain things or you don't do certain things well, right? Because critique is good, but critique as it sometimes comes in the academy can be silencing, right, and shaming. So one of the things that is important for me for giving back, because it was done for me, right? So I had teachers who took me aside when I finished my homework too early, right, or finished classwork, and they gave me things, right, and they attended to me. And so for me, attending to students is part of how I teach. There are tangible ways that we all give back. We all give to charity. We have my siblings and I have a charity in my mom's name that allows us to be able to help educate kids in Jamaica who the Jamaican government can't afford to build schools and maintain them. And so we, part of our income goes to making sure that kids have schools, the teachers are paid, and that they have the resources that they need. But we all give back in the everyday, right? It's the making sure that when we have a moment where we could either go off and harm someone or say the wrong thing, or we can take a step back, we just take a moment to think about empathy, right? If I was in this situation, how would I want to be spoken to, right? Especially in difficult moments. So I think and it's in the work, right? The figuring out how to, I always want to write papers that my grandmother could read. And my grandmother my grandmother had a 3rd grade education, right? But if I can't write to her, then I don't know what I'm doing. So I do the work, and when we do this kind of work in community, it's reminding myself that this isn't about us. Like, we have a responsibility, we have a responsibility to Derrick and Sanika and Erica and everybody else, that if we leave people in the worst of conditions because it's convenient for us, then it's the worst kind of evil. It's just the worst kind of evil. Privilege, we can't do that.
So I appreciate your narrative about love being commonplace and perhaps mundane, and thus we forget about it. But I also think like there are many situations where we just don't provide love kind of by default. And one that came to mind, one that's especially heartbreaking to me is, you know, even in Ann Arbor, walking down the streets, people might be begging.
Absolutely.
And often people don't respond. They look away, or they don't change gaze at all.
We disappear them.
Yeah. And so I guess I was curious, for those bits that are, I guess, in society now commonplace to neglect, do you have thoughts about studying those or the like?
Yeah. So the work that I do certainly focuses on communities that have been, where we've disinvested from the communities. But it's the same dynamic, right? Regardless of whether it's Ann Arbor or it's the Bronx or someplace else. Asking ourselves what it is, how do we come to a point where we can disappear people, right? Or disappear their needs, or judge people when we have been beneficiaries, in many cases, of a particular kind of compassion that has let us be able to live a different kind of life. Being able to ask ourselves that just genuinely and figure out what the answers are, but also think about what is our responsibility as a university? What is our responsibility as people to make sure that everybody is cared for? I mean, it's part of the larger conversation, right, that we have politically about who's deserving of healthcare. I mean, the fact that we have those conversations is mind-boggling, right? We've made it into a political question, but at the end of it, it's a spiritual question. Who deserves to be sick? Like, that's crazy. Who deserves to be sick and to be left sick? And we would answer those questions differently if we were the ones who were sick, right? So to your question, all these questions of humanity show up for us every day, and whether we politicize them or we make them into economic questions is in some ways irrelevant, because at the end of the day, it's a human question, it's a spiritual question. What do we deserve, and who deserves to suffer the worst of what humanity can bring? And how do we get comfortable with that? We need a whole science around that.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
One thing that resonated with me was how you say that we lack a vocabulary to describe love. And I'm curious, when you're doing your research, if you have certain terms that you use to define types of love, whether they're created ones or ones that you've co-opted from other languages, and what that looks like.
Yeah. I usually try to pay attention to what people are saying, but then there are other times when phrases that are common in Black communities I'll use. So sometimes I'll ask people, who loves up on you, right? Because it's different from who loves you, right? So who loves you, people can love you and not call you, right? But the people who love up on you are the people who show up with the blanket and the chicken soup, and who curl up on your bed with you when you need. So to be able to think about the vernacular for me that comes with African American communities, so that's one place. But sometimes I ask people to sing me the song that they sing when they want to communicate about what love looks like for them, right? Because sometimes a narrative, a storytelling kind of path doesn't work. But we all have the things that we sing when, that song that reminds you that you were loved, or maybe you're not loved anymore. So there are different pathways to being able to get people into language, and sometimes it's not words, right? Sometimes it's just show me how your body feels when you feel held. And that may be the pathway into the conversation.
Jackie, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed hearing it. So my question is, I really want to build on the point of developing love for people you can't stand.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yes.
And how challenging that can be.
Yeah.
And I guess taking it to scale nationally, I mean, now that we are in a presidential, election year, I mean, the politics are going to get even more cutthroat. And like our nation is going to get even more divided and divisive and partisan. So I guess from what we've learned in studying love within urban contexts, how can we use that knowledge to kind of spread that on a national scale to try to develop more love amongst all Americans?
So you're just going to ask me some kind of, like, I can't solve the question, but okay.
Just your thoughts. Just your thoughts.
So, okay, a couple of things come to mind, one of which is a conversation I had with one of the participants in our study who talked about how, actually it was Derrick. So at a certain point, Derrick was talking about, for him, the complexity of love in the community where he lives is, at one point, people could be physically fighting. And at another point, the same people will sort of protect each other, right? And so he talks about the fact that you're going to disagree, right? You're going to have moments when it all falls apart. But at some point, you got to be able to figure out somebody's heart and to be able to separate out what they said and what they did from the heart, the best heart that they have. And I think the answer for me to the question kind of lies in that. I'm not pretending that everybody means good for others, right? Or that everyone fundamentally can do the kumbaya moment. I'm not that naive. But I think there are lessons that show up in spaces where people literally have to sort of duke it out and then figure out how to love it out, right? And you can't escape each other because you can't go anywhere, right? In those moments and in those contexts, I think we learn a lot about recognizing that you've got to be able to see people in order to be able to see their heart. You got to know when the person says the thing that is racist but is not intending to harm you, right? Or says the thing that is sexist but is not intending to harm. And to figure out, how do you bridge across that divide so that you can say, let's talk about what you just said, and I know you didn't mean it. And that I know you didn't mean it is that moment of visibility, right? I know you didn't intend to hurt me. Is that moment of visibility, because you have to be able to see that the other has good intentions or the capacity to be good. So to be able to do that with people who you disagree with, but it is really important. But I think the second part of it is also remembering we are all the beneficiaries of somebody's grace, right? We all have said something, all have done something that others could have walked away from us for. And if they had walked away from us, we would all be patently alone. So being able to do that perspective taking, but also to be able to do if we're going to live as a human community, I got to do for somebody what was done for me, even if I don't really remember the moment when the person did the forgiveness thing or the compassion thing. So you at least have to try, right? So I think that's the best I can offer, but also recognize when it's not going to work. So there's some times when people are not interested in having a conversation, and you can sit around and try to beat your head against the wall. You may not be the one to have that conversation with them. Somebody else might be. But it doesn't mean you demean them. That's never okay.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to follow up on the gentleman's question over there. Mm-hmm. And the issue that I've never been able to resolve for myself is when you see somebody, panhandling or begging for money in the street. And the example I can give you is maybe a little bit more remote. Like the Port Authority in New York, years ago, it was just packed with, let's just say it wasn't a wonderful area. Mm-hmm. And, the situation is the government is saying, don't give to the people in the street, support social services, support charities and all that. Mm-hmm. And yet you walk by these people and you don't want to dehumanize them. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what the right reaction to that is.
Yeah. I mean, it's complicated. I think it's got to be a both and, right? So one of the common discussions that people have is, do we give money to someone who is struggling with addiction because they're going to go use the money for drugs or alcohol or whatever it is? And there are good points on the yes and no, right? But on some level, one thing to consider is, if you are living in hell, who is to what does it mean that the thing that gets you out of that, even for an hour, that people won't give you the grace to be able to figure that out until you can figure your way into a better space, right? Because the reality is, and this is not to support like the notion that, you know, we should support addiction, but the reality is sometimes I did clinical work, but and watching people live through the most hellish of circumstances, I could understand why they had to drink, right? So to get through a night of hell so that you can figure out in the morning what to do, while it may not be the best of circumstances, to deny somebody the opportunity to figure out how to just make it through the next few hours is something that, you know, for me, I have to grapple with, right? Because social services is not going to show up at your doorstep at night to help you through that moment. So there has to be a both and. There has to be a long-term strategy to dismantle structures that are creating problems or to help people through the worst moments of their lives. But we also have got to figure out how to build temporary bridges across a night to help somebody figure, like, how, and it's a slippery slope, right? So at some point, if you say, I'll only give you money for food, but I'll only give you money if you go get healthy food. Like, I can take my $3 to Whole Foods and I can get exactly nothing, right? Or I can go get something that you may think is unhealthy food, but it gets me through a night, right? And it's the same, that you slip that slope down, that hamburger that's $1 will get me through a night. That alcohol that I need right now to get me through tomorrow so I can live, so because you can't be sober and dead, right? So if it's a choice between my life or drinking tonight, then perhaps drinking tonight so that tomorrow I can end up alive and then somebody can help me walk across the bridge to sobriety. There's got to be a both and there. And the clean answers are never going to be real. They're just never going to be. They don't match reality. When you live in hell, you don't get to make those choices. You just don't. And we don't get the right to determine how people use it. Once you give money, it's given. It's like, you don't get to monitor it. Like, my mom can't give me money and then, like, here's what I'd like you to do with it. No, you then keep it. It's not my money then, right? So if you're going to give, and then you help people. If you care about their sobriety, help them with that. But a lot of the times we don't. We care about the judgment once we've given. So giving the money gives us a path into judging people, and that's not okay. If you care, help.
Thank you.
I have a quick follow-up just on that. And the follow-up is just, has there been work on that, on kind of that judgment passing that you do really quickly to decide if I'm going to give you my money for you to buy this, but not that?
So I didn't hear the question.
Has there been work on that, or is that something to kind of, I don't know, do more research on?
There's a small body of research that I'm aware of on the concept of deservingness and how we decide who deserves help. And how deservingness then shapes who gives help and who receives help. And their race and gender and class have huge implications for, and physical and phenotype have huge implications for how we decide on deservingness. So if you are a tall man or a large-framed man, you're often, especially in certain circumstances, you're less likely to be seen as deserving of help because the assumption is you should be able to help yourself, regardless of what life has brought to you, right? If you're a smaller-framed man, you're more likely than the tall or big-framed man to be seen as deserving of help, but you're less likely than a woman to get help, right? So gender and size matter. And there is literature, especially around domestic violence, that has implications for this. So dark-complexioned, large-framed women are seen as less deserving of help, and they're responded to that way by police. So they're less likely to get help from the police. They're less likely to have police officers take their statements. They're less likely to be seen as victims, right? And you can sort of play the rest of the tape out. So deservingness is something that people have studied, particularly in the domestic violence world.
Thank you.
We've got our work cut out for us.
We do, but the fact that the work is being done, right, is in and of itself the source of optimism. We just have to amp it up.
Going back to the passerby on the street, I asked more about studies, but more on the human level. Do you have any recommendations? A lot of people don't pause, and so I'm curious, like, pausing and acknowledging the person. To me, that seems right, but like, it's also, if you're running somewhere, it's hard to do. So just practical recommendations.
Well, I think definitely making the decision to pause and making the decision that you're going to decide to pause as often as you can, and we will not be perfect, right? There will be lots of logical circumstances where you won't, either you're rushing or, you know, there are reasons why the context suggests that it's not a good idea for you to pause at a particular time. But I think thinking about the ways in which we're going to pause, right? So a friend of mine talked about a circumstance where she gave somebody food that she had left over from a restaurant, she went to a restaurant, and she gave the person the food, and he said, "I don't want it." And he was clearly homeless, clearly on the street. And she was outraged. And I was like, how often do people just shove food at you? And you're like, thank you for giving me the food I didn't ask for. You don't know why this person did. So it's a different thing if the way that you pause is to say, "Sir or ma'am, have you eaten today? Can I get you something?" And if you're near some place where you can get the food, asking, you know, these are the things that they have. Is there something in particular I can get you, right? Because that's how we would want to be treated. So to make sure that when we pause with the same recognition of dignity, right? When you care to share food with someone, you ask what they want. You don't just give them whatever you have left over, and you don't give them what you think they need. So being able to do that intentionally. So I think loving intentionally is the key thing. Just do for others. The golden rule. I mean, really, we can just stop this whole talk with that. How do you want to be treated? How do you want to be loved? Do that to somebody else. That's it.
Well, Professor Mattis, thank you so much. This is such beautiful work. And listening to it, I was sort of wondering, I mean, you showed examples of really profound forms of affiliation and love between really disenfranchised people within one group. Yeah. And I think, you know, there are such powerful forces, I think, dehumanizing people. And it's very politically expedient. It makes money or it leads to power. It's a very old story. Yeah. And the question I was going to ask is, like, kind of similar to what the gentleman over here said, is what, you know, have you seen experiences where, since it's the norm, in a sense, for majority or dominant culture people to probably dehumanize, and it's a message that's, you know, that's fed to them quite a bit. Are there ways that, you know, little bits of humanization can come in? Or have you seen these types of things where, like this gentleman said, even just, you know, recognizing the humanity of somebody who's begging? Yeah. One of the things that keeps me hopeful, especially about intercultural and interracial relations and interclass relations, is certainly watching our students, right? But just watching people every day. So even in the context that we're talking about here, Erica works in a shelter where people of all races and backgrounds come in. And she's really intentional about the fact that she knows that people sometimes walk in thinking that she's not going to like them because she's Black and they're not, right? And so she's really intentional about making sure that she walks up with a smile and whatever she needs to do to make sure that you know she sees you. And then she just goes about the business of, "Ma'am, do you want to take a shower today?" Right? So you just making that decision to approach fully human is certainly what she does and what people do all the time. Even in the context of our students, I love teaching because I get to show up with these kids in class, many of whom are from very wealthy backgrounds, many of whom are not, who don't look like each other, would never have met were it not for the fact that they showed up in these classrooms. And these beautiful young people are trying to figure out how to care for each other in the most amazing ways. So
watching students protect each other, right? Listening to students talk, ask questions of each other, and watching over the course of 15 weeks, kids who would not ever again have met, figure out how to be friends and talk to each other and love each other, right, is amazing. Watching parents, students bring their parents to class, which is usually frightening, and I'm like, I'm gonna need you not to do that, but they do. And the parents are sometimes flabbergasted at what their kids are reading, but also amazed by who their kids are friends with, right? And they get to see, you know, here's a kid who was raised in a conservative home, who has a friend who's transgender and is like, I could not care less. Let me tell you why this person is the best person in my life, right? Being in a university setting, but being in community settings where people figured this out, intercultural communication is not anomalous. People do this every day, right? Folks across racial lines have been friends forever, even in the context of a system that tries to set us up not to be. So, you know, I think if we studied that, right? If we studied how do people end up being best friends who seem to have nothing in common, but figure out the in common. If we studied that, we could figure some things out quickly. But we do more of the studying of intercultural conflict as if intercultural conflict is in and of itself bad. It's not. Right? Because conflict is not a bad thing. How you resolve the conflict may be problematic, but the conflict is it just signals that you're human and you're alive. It's a long answer to your question, but you know, have you seen on Facebook this picture of like these toddlers? Like they're two little boys, and one is African American and one is white, and they see each other and they're friends, and they run at each other, and they're like 18 months, and they're doing one of these kind of things, and that for me, that's the answer to your question. We don't start at racism, we build to it. So, and we don't start at classism, we build to it. So if we just watch people who can figure out how to ask a question, do what 3-year-olds do. Will you be my best friend? And then they just talk. And they don't care what you're wearing. Mostly because they don't know, right? But I think if we can just figure out how to, like, I see you. What are you into?
Well, let's thank Dr. Mattis.
Thank you.
This program was recorded on January 27th, 2020 at the Ann Arbor District Library.